So I wanted to thank Sun Kim and Jenny Shim and all of the organizers of this seminar. I hope that you're all having fun and that you continue to enjoy the talks. Today, I wanted to talk about the Korean War, and I wanted to think about the events leading up to the war and what happened during the war, and especially the aftermath of the war that came to involve the arrival of Korean immigrants to the United States. So let's begin with some of the events leading up to the war. And I was thinking, I know that there are a range of grades that you all teach, and I do think that most of the things that I'll be discussing is good for upper levels. So maybe some middle school, but also definitely high school. But I definitely think that there are ways that you could incorporate thinking about Korean immigrants, especially for younger grades as well. So after World War II, a lot of you probably know this history, but after World War II, the relation, oh, sorry, everything okay?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, great. So after World War II, the relationship between Korea and the United States, it really changed dramatically. So with the ending of World War II, with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs in Japan, one on August 6th in 1945 in Hiroshima, and the second US atomic bomb is dropped in Nagasaki 3 days later. And as we all know, these bombs contributed to the end of World War II. But it also resulted in the loss of Japan's colonial holdings, and Korea was one of Japan's colonial holdings since 1910. So after World War II, there's this interesting moment where Korea is liberated from Japanese rule, but almost immediately it is reoccupied by the Soviet Union and the United States, and it is divided. And so the U.S. military commanders feared that there was Soviet interest in taking over Korea, taking over the newly liberated Korean Peninsula. And so on the evening of August 10th in 1945, which is just a day after the United States dropped the second bomb in Japan, this State War Navy Coordinating Committee asked Dean Rusk and Charles H. Bonesteel to divide the Korean Peninsula. And it is rumored that the young U.S. colonel spent less than 30 minutes deciding upon the 38th parallel. And this is when an invisible line that could, it would eventually, along the 38th parallel, it would cleave a division so deep and permanent that this division can now be seen from space. Of course, we all know that Korea remains divided. And, beyond the geography of the demilitarized zone is the human cost of division. There are hundreds of thousands of families who remain separated by this line. And between 1945 and 1948, U.S. occupying forces established military bases and implemented economic programs in the South, while the Soviet Union administered control of the North. And U.S. officials billed the military occupation of South Korea as a temporary trusteeship that was supposed to end in 1948. But if we, flash forward to today, there are still 24,500 U.S. servicemen and women stationed in 15 military bases across South Korea. So we know how permanent this division has become. But at this time in 1945 through 1950, I think that the Truman administration wasn't really sure how much they would be involved in Korea, but this really became solidified with the beginning of the Korean War. So on June 25th, 1950, there were already skirmishes along the 38th parallel between the North and the South all throughout 1949. But on June 25th, 1950, it's rumored that North Korean soldiers shot across the 38th parallel, and the United States entered the war unilaterally. And they committed U.S. air and naval forces with President Truman's verbal support, but in advance of United Nations, Pentagon, or congressional approval. And so again, the U.S. military was supposed to leave in 1948, but the military was really still very present in the peninsula. And this is why they were able to get involved so quickly as soon as war broke out along the 38th parallel. So in the beginning, the U.S. officials described what was happening in Korea as a limited police action. But this, of course, turned into a full-scale war, especially once China entered to defend North Korea. And that happens in October of 1950. So while technically the United Nations was a collection of countries, and they are the ones who fought in Korea, the US deployed 350,000 troops and made up 90% of all UN forces. And I think this is important for us to think about because the US involvement in the Korean War was on such a large scale. And so even though we talk about the UN being involved in Korea, it was really primarily the United States. During the war, the US dropped 635,000 tons of bombs on the peninsula. And we have to remember that the peninsula is about the size of Minnesota. So this is a small space. And with this bombing, entire cities were wiped off of the map. It was extremely devastating. The war ended up claiming an estimated 34,000 American, 900,000 Chinese, and over 3 million Korean lives. And some even put the estimate closer to 4 million Korean lives. And the majority of deaths were actually of Korean civilians. And again, this is in large part because of different kinds of bombing campaigns that took place during this war. So when you look at the numbers, you could really grasp the scale of this war. And you can see that while this is considered one of America's forgotten wars, this changed the very fabric of Korea and those who lived through the war. It also is technically not over. At the end of the war, there was an armistice that was signed, but it ended the fighting, but not the war. So the war is technically still ongoing. And as we know, there's still ongoing tensions between North and South Korea. So in the US, most Americans did not know anything about Korea before this war. And the population of Koreans in the United States was around 8,000 before the war. And 7,000 Koreans actually lived in Hawaii. So if we think about this, there was very little knowledge about Korea at this time. So it was all the war footage that came to the United States throughout 1950 and 1953 that Americans really were first introduced to Korea. And so I wanted to share with you some of the ways that they learned about Korea through this kind of footage. So much of the film reels and different things that reached the United States was through the US Department of Defense. And at this point, the US Department of Defense created a publicity arm, and they did a lot of the filming and then sent a lot of that footage over to different newsreel companies like Universal Newsreel. And a lot of what you see was this mix of demonstrating US military might, but also US humanitarian aid. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of a clip. This is from a 1952 newsreel, and it showed the first half. I just showed you, these are a couple stills from the first half of the newsreel, and it shows American tanks and guns going across the lines. And then the second half showed this.
Should we be hearing sounds or?
Sorry, did the sound not come through?
No.
Let's see.
When you screen share, there'll be a button to check off that says share sound also.
Okay, great. Advanced sharing options. Yeah. There are different share. Oh, there we go. Share screen. Okay. Let me try that again.
Mm-hmm.
The clothes were collected by the Marine Corps League in many American cities. And don't they go over with these Korean youngsters? With help from friendly American Marines, a new dress goes over just fine.
Okay, were you able to hear that one?
Yep.
Okay, great. So a lot of this footage shows, American donated goods going to help Korean children, and it shows the U.S. servicemen who are delivering the goods and helping the children. So this is one kind of example of the kinds of news that were reaching Americans during the war. Another thing that you see a lot of is Americans wearing these donated and kind of embracing American culture. So here's one photograph. This is from National Geographic in May of 1953. And the caption reads, "Young cowboys just off the Korean range relax with Roy Rogers." And I just love this photograph because chances are they couldn't read the Roy Rogers cartoon, but it shows them, pretty staged, wearing cowboy boots and being very interested in American culture, to kind of narrate what the U.S. involvement in the war is doing. You see a lot of these kinds of images. You see images of young Korean boys dressed up in U.S. military fatigues. You also see a lot of footage of children who are suffering, to promote donations, American donations to help Korean children during the war. So these are some examples of the things that you would see in the U.S. during the war. Probably the most well-known and highly publicized portrayal of Korea in the U.S. came in the form of the Korean Children's Choir. And in 1954, 25 Korean children, they were between the ages of 6 and 12. They toured 50 American cities and they sang to sold-out audiences. So this tour was sponsored by the American Korean Foundation. These children ended up performing at the White House. Here they're shown singing at the Statue of Liberty. They were on that television program named That Tune. They were also, they had a record and all of the proceeds went to help Korean children. They were also a really huge source of pride in Korea because the choir was actually formed on the heels in 1945 after liberation from Japan. And so the choir was already kind of in existence, and then they were brought to the US after the war to raise money. And it was a very successful fundraising campaign. It's estimated that they raised about $10 million for recovery efforts in Korea. And let's see, during the tour in the US, it was continually emphasized that the children were quote unquote double orphans who had lost both parents in the war. And that was actually not accurate. A lot of these children actually had living parents, but that was the story that was being told to American audiences. And in response, there were many Americans who actually tried to adopt the children, but they couldn't because there were no legal pathways to transnational adoptions at this time. And I always find this really interesting. I'll share this part in a little bit later about the interest in Korean adoptions. So there was this kind of beginning interest in Korean adoption through all of these different kinds of news that was reaching the US, but it's really not until US missionaries get involved that the actual practice of transnational adoptions really takes off. So these are, this is Harry Holt, and this is Bertha Holt, and they were Christian evangelicals who spoke publicly and very often about the plight facing mixed race Korean children. So these were the children who had Korean mothers and US servicemen fathers, and they were born during and after the war. And in Korea, mixed race children, in the 1950s, they faced discrimination. They could not be part of the Korean family registries because they were born out of wedlock and didn't have a Korean male head of the household. So they were left off of Korean family registries. And in 1955, the Holts went to Korea and they adopted 8 mixed race children to bring into their home. And they brought 4 more children to place in Christian American homes in the United States. So this is a photograph from the day that they brought the children to the United States. And if you look over here, you see photographers. Harry Holt was very good at publicizing these events. He would bring all of these different journalists. He held a press conference after this event. And many Americans started to learn about, Korean children and started to learn that they were quote unquote available for adoption. And so even though the legal structures were not put in place. And so you have figures who are like the Holts who are going to Korea and making it known in the United States. And then on the Korean side, President Lee Syngman was interested in removing the mixed race children from Korea. So in Korea, I think that some of the folks who will be talking during this seminar will talk about Korean culture and the importance placed on bloodlines. And so in Korea, the mixed race children went against these kind of traditional ideas about bloodlines and about Korean nationalism. And so in 1953, President Lee Syngman created a directive, and his directive was to remove all of the mixed race children from Korea and to send them to, quote, the land of their fathers. So to send them to the United States. And so there was, the Holtz actually ended up working with the President Ri's administration. They created the Children Placement Service on the Korean side to facilitate the movement of predominantly mixed race children from Korea to the United States. And so this is kind of how the process begins, and then it grows from there. The transnational adoptions grow from there. So after this event where Holt adopted these children, he started to receive hundreds of letters from Americans wishing to adopt. And this is what I was going to say earlier, but it's very interesting to think about the 1950s. If we think about family formation in the 1950s, we think about ongoing civil rights struggles in the 1950s. The idea of an interracial family in the United States is unusual at this time. So I always find it very interesting, the interest that American couples had in bringing these children to the United States. And there was of course, a very large segment of the population that was, they were childless couples. And if we think about the importance of family in the context of the Cold War in the 1950s, we could see how the idea of the nuclear family with parents and children was something that was very important in the United States. I think it always has been, but especially in the 1950s. So it's this interesting moment, I think, that creates the circumstances that lead to transnational adoptions from Korea. So in the 1950s, it was estimated that about 70% of all Korean adoptees who came from Korea were mixed race. But after the 1960s, that slowly started to change to, quote unquote, full Korean children who are being adopted into the United States. And to give you a context of numbers, between 1953 and 1965, there are over 6,000 Korean adoptees who came to the United States. Oh, sorry, forgot to advance those. Okay. So I wanted to give you an example of the kind of news about these adoptees that are reaching the United States. And here's one article. This child is Ri Kang-yong, and he originally, when he was younger, he actually appeared in war relief posters that came to the United States to help raise money during the war. And then after the war in 1956, he is adopted by a white American widow. And this is from Life magazine, and it shows him on his first day in America. And it shows him, looking very American. He's wearing this gingham shirt and these pants, these khakis, and he's doing all these American things, like he's talking on the telephone and watching television. And so these constructions of these kind of model constructions about Korean children who become very robust once they come to the United States, and they are very Americanized almost upon arrival. These are the kind of model constructions that surrounded the arrival of Korean adoptees at this time. And but these model constructions also, of course, hid the lived realities, I think, of a lot of these children. And if you look at the case studies of different social welfare organizations, you get to see another side of what Korean adoptions meant for the children who are coming over. So I saw different reports of children who were chanting that they wanted to go home to Korea, and they wouldn't stop chanting these things. There were reports, several reports of children, expressing that they wanted to go home to Korea. There are lots of child reports about children who cry frequently. There was a report about a child who refused to eat rice, and the social worker interpreted this as a sign of the child adapting to American ways. But of course, if we think about this, it could also be a sign of homesickness, of not wanting to be reminded of all the things that were lost. So if we think about what the public narrative was around these children, it really eclipsed what the actual experiences of many of these children who had, of course, experienced severe trauma, having just come from the war. Many of them had lost parents. Some of them were separated from living parents who remained in Korea. So I always like to, when I teach this topic to my college students, I always, kind of push our students to think about what is hidden. What you see in the public is obviously and most often not what is happening in reality. So while the media focused on that kind of perspective about transnational adoptions, when it came to interracial adoptions, the media, of course, did not show what was happening behind the scenes. The reality is that, the media did not talk about how many of these children were actually separated from their families during the chaos of evacuation. Many of the families were separated from their children during the war and then couldn't find them. And some of those children ended up in the United States. When it came to mixed race children, of course, both parents were probably still living. Many of these children many Korean mothers were trying to raise their mixed race children in Korea. But there were US agencies who were really trying to encourage these women to relinquish their children. There was a lot of pressure there. US servicemen fathers, many of them were still alive. Some of them knew about their children, some of them did not, but many of them did not support the children in Korea. And so there are all these various kinds of stories that, of course, you never see in the media. And the other thing that I wanted to share with you is the process of placing these children, because I think it's quite revealing. And so let me show you here. Whoops. Okay, so here, this is an adoption agency form that was used at Holt Adoption Agency. And this is from 1965, but I also saw this in earlier kind of forms that were being used. And when the children are being admitted, there was often an area where they could indicate if the child looked like they were mixed race. And then there were these areas where they could indicate things like, what is the complexion? This is medium fair. The comparison to the picture, there's often a picture that was stapled here, and then they would describe same, or sometimes you would see darker than the photograph or lighter than the photograph. And then they would have sections for like hair and eyes, about the color of the hair, about the texture of the hair, about the eyes here. I've even seen dental records where the dentist indicates what the skin complexion of the child is, which of course has nothing to do with dental health. So all of these markers were being recorded in Korea, and the purpose of this was to assure that the mixed race child the Korean white child would end up with white adoptive parents in the US, and the Korean Black child would end up with African American couples in the United States. And so it's interesting because I think that a lot of the narratives that you see publicly promote this idea of, the US is this racial harmony, and Americans love people who don't look like them, but there were definitely limits to the kind of liberal messaging that was coming through with Korean adoptions at the time, because there was a great effort to adhere to not crossing a Black-white racial line. And that process happened in Korea, and then of course continued in the United States when it came to the placement process. And so I always find it fascinating and troubling how US racializing practices transferred borders and went to Korea, as we could see here in this example. After the Korean War, in addition to the arrival of Korean and mixed race adoptees, came the immigration of Korean military brides. And during the war, Korean war brides were a novelty. They were kind of like the narratives that came of model Korean adoptees. You would occasionally see news of model Korean military brides. So here's one example. This is really early on. This is in 1951. There were very few Korean military brides arriving at this time, maybe like about 11 that are recorded. But here's one of them, and her name is Lee Young-sun, and she's married Johnny Morgan. They married on Valentine's Day in 1951. This is in Life magazine again, and you could see the kind of Cold War narrative about international exchange. You see the American, Johnny's parents are wearing the clothing that was sent to them by Lee's parents. And in the text, it talks about how they are interested in eating kim, which is the Korean, the seaweed. And they talk about how it's a Korean delicacy, and they're learning about Korea, and it's all about international exchange. And here at the bottom, you see Lee learning how to make Johnny's favorite Carolina style gravy. All of these kind of indications that she will be a good housewife, that she will learn how to cook in American ways. These are the kinds of messages that are being communicated at the time. But after the war, when the US military continued to stay on in Korea, it became very clear that these military marriages would continue. And after that point, you really don't see very much public news about Korean military brides, because now it is clear that this is going to be a continual source of immigration. It's also important to note that at this time in the 1950s, there are still anti-miscegenation laws that prevent mixed racial marriages in over 40 states. So this whole idea of Korean military brides coming in is not one that I would say is very welcome in the United States at the time. And just so we could keep the context of this, today in the United States, especially with the US military staying on in Korea, there are now well over 100,000 Korean military brides in the United States. And okay, so yes, so this has a huge impact on immigration. Further complicating the narrative around Korean military brides was the practice of US militarized prostitution in Korea at this time. And so that also complicated the narrative about who these Korean women were, what the US military involvement in Korea resulted in. And so I wanted to give you one more snapshot of the kind of media constructions of what Americans saw in the United States at this time when it came to Korean women. So one of the safer representations of the Korean military bride or of Korean women to help Americans kind of grapple with who are these Korean women came in the form of the Kim sisters. And these are not Korean military brides, but this was a very popular singing group. They started singing for US troops during the war when they were just children. And here's a photograph of them in Korea. It was actually two sisters and a cousin. Mia is the cousin, and Aija and Sue they were sisters. And a US agent discovers them in Korea, and they bring them to perform in Las Vegas in 1959. I always tell my students this was the first K-pop group in the United States. They became extremely popular. They appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show over 25 times. This is the cover of their first album. And I'm just going to show you a really short clip. You could find these on YouTube. If you have time, you could watch the whole thing because it's really entertaining. But this was footage from the Hollywood Palace. It was filmed in the 1960s. Milton Berle is the host, and he introduces them as the multi-talented sisters who could play 20 instruments. So let's watch this little clip. So, so here they're playing them. I think this is I don't know what those are called, but they also played the marimba, they played bagpipes, they played all these different instruments. And in the media, in addition to being described as being this multi-talented group of sisters, they were also described as being innocent virginal sisters. So in different kinds of reports, they would interview the women and say, what do you do when men ask you out after the show? And they respond very innocently, like, oh, I always say that I have to bring along my sisters. And then usually they declined the invitation. There was another story where they were invited to the Playboy Mansion, and they went there and they were just so upset by what they saw that they hid in the bathroom. So there were all these different kinds of stories that were coming out that really build them as these very innocent sisters. And this, I think, was very different, right, than the kind of existing narratives around who Korean women were in relationship to the US military at the time. So I always find the Kim sisters to be a very interesting way through which Americans were being introduced to Korean women. Here are a couple photographs from a Life magazine spread from 1960. And one of the things that I find interesting in this one photograph, this is a kind of a common trope that you would see with Korean adoptees in the media at this time, is the children watching television. So you kind of see that trope here with the Kim sisters. You also see them here made up for one of their stage performances. Here they're wearing hanboks. A lot of times they would wear their hanboks and then they would take off their hanboks, and underneath they would be wearing a much more form-fitting kind of dress. We would see that in some of their performances. And so so these are some of the ways, with the Korean adoptees and with the Kim sisters, that Korea arrived to the US during the early Cold War period. And Korea came to the US in ways that were both imagined, right? How they were being produced in American culture, and real, because there were close to 14,000 Korean immigrants who arrived to the United States as adoptees and brides. They also arrived as exchange students in the decade following the war. There were thousands of exchange students who came to the United States and ended up staying on in Korea, even though they were, in the United States, even though they were supposed to return. Another important thing to note is that it's estimated that 40% of Korean immigration to the United States after 1965 are somehow connected to a military bride. So with the Family Reunification Clause that was in the Immigration Act of 1965, many Koreans came to the U.S. through their familial ties to a Korean military bride. So that is pretty significant too in terms of that connection. So when we think about all of this together, the Korean War ended up having a very profound effect on the millions of Koreans who lost their lives, but also the millions who survived and were forever changed by the war. It had a direct impact on Korean children and women who ended up in the United States. So the lasting effects of this war was definitely something that was experienced on both sides of the Pacific. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the US military stays on in Korea. We hear about Korea in the news in terms of the North and the South. Putin just visited North Korea. There are all these ways in which this division and what happens in Korea is still, of course, very relevant to global politics. And so I think that when we think about all these things together, it becomes clear that the US moniker of the Korean War being a forgotten war is one that couldn't be further from the truth, especially for Koreans who didn't have the luxury of forgetting the war. And so looking at the time here, I wanted to end by just showing you some resources that you could, I think these are probably more appropriate again for the upper grade levels. So maybe like 9th through 12th grade, but there might be useful resources in here for the lower, younger grades as well. So I contributed a lesson plan to the California Ethnic Studies curriculum, and my focus on the Korean War and the origins of transnational adoptions. And this is for a lesson plan that was designed for the 11th grade, because in the 11th grade, they do US history and social studies, and they look at US foreign policy. But I think that some of the things in this lesson plan could be helpful for everyone. One of the things that I wanted to share is that there is this really powerful documentary, Memory of a Forgotten War. And it is, I think it's too intense to show younger kids. This might be okay for high school students, but I would definitely screen the film first. It should be available on Canopy. But there is a really great study guide, and the study guide explains, information about this war, what happened. It describes the devastating impact of the war on Korea. It also describes how the war set the tone for US-Korea relations in the second half of the 20th century. And so this is the guide. They have a web guide that goes along with the film, but you can even use the information that's in the guide, even if you don't choose to use the film. So I just wanted to show you some of the pages from here. They have study questions that are connected to the film if you do show the film, and they have a really great resource section at the end where you could find additional resources on the Korean War. Another activity that I worked on for the curriculum is to look at the article that I showed you before. And, I think that the activity includes, reading the text of the actual document and have students kind of underline some of the key words that demonstrate how it was that adoption was being presented to the American public. And so in this activity, the students are asked to do a close reading of the text and also to do a close reading of the photographs to think about how it was that this idea or process of Korean adoption is being communicated to the American public and what it teaches the American public about who Koreans were. And then for the upper grades to kind of think against the grain and think about, well, what is hidden in this kind of public visualization of who Koreans are, what is missing from the conversation based on what they know about the Korean War. So this is another activity. And then I wanted to share with you a really powerful documentary film. And I think that this would be good for middle schoolers and high schoolers. It's called First Person Plural. This is available on Canopy. And I'm just going to show you just the trailer of this. Let me see.
We're off to another different time in our life now. We understand things better, and hopefully it will bring us closer.
From the moment that I arrived from Korea to San Francisco, my father filmed every moment of our life together and really captured this whole process of my becoming American. The film is about my adoption and everything sort of going wonderfully, except that at a certain point there's an unexpected turn of events, and I discover that I wasn't who everybody thought I was, and discover a whole new identity. This was a time, I think, in the United States where total assimilation was the norm, and they didn't think of any other way to deal with me, really.
To me, it was quite scary. I was afraid I was going to lose you.
Traditionally, adoption has been so much about cutting off the birth family. There's so many secrets and lies, hidden tensions and things like that.
This matter of non-communication is a two-way street. You could have said just exactly what you did now, and it would have thrown the doors wide open.
My hope is that adoptees, birth families, and adoptive parents would be able to watch it together, and that it might give people courage to open up.
So I think that this is a really powerful documentary film. I show this to a lot of my students, and everyone's crying and everyone has this deep connection to it because it does follow her through her high school years, and we get to meet her American siblings. And then she goes to Korea to try and find her birth parents, and she does end up finding them. And it's about this whole journey. And I think that this is such a powerful film to teach because in so many ways, Korean adoptees are often not viewed as part of Korean immigrants. I think they're viewed, they're usually not included in conversations about who Korean immigrants are. And so kind of taking this deep dive about, what happened to Korean children as a result of the war, but also what the experiences and viewpoints of Korean adoptees are is really important because we don't often see that in the historical record. And this is just a really well done film, and it hits on all of these levels that I think a lot of your students will be able to connect to, this idea of identity, these ideas of feeling a sense of belonging and trying to figure out who you are. Like, I think these are all things that, we still struggle with as adults, but I think especially high school students, something that they could really connect with. So I just wanted to end with some of those resources. I will stop my share and see if anyone has any questions or.
All right, thank you. And maybe take a moment to see what questions you might have. There was one question in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Oh, from Ernest Lee, about U.S. involvement in Korean War. U.S. deployment was considered a police action, hence no formal declaration of war by the U.S. Congress. But why were they so inadequately prepared? From June to September of 1950, they lost almost 75% of the South Korean territory. That is a great question. I think that what happens in Korea is the fighting is very different than what the fighting was during World War II. And so when it came to military strategy, the U.S. was inadequately prepared. One of the things that U.S. military advisors said that they struggled with was the presence of guerrilla fighters. So Koreans who would come from hiding places, who would come in disguise. If you think about South Korea versus North Korea, these are Koreans on both sides. And so one of the things that U.S. commanders often wrote about is we don't know who our enemy is and who is our ally. And so this is also one of the reasons why so many Korean civilians were killed. It is said that there were people were unsure about who was a North Korean and who was a South Korean, if we think about, war, the context of war. And this is why innocent civilians were killed, because there was fear that there was a North Korean fighter who was hiding in the midst. So there were all of these ways in which what happens in Korea actually ends up happening in Vietnam. And this is another reason why the US military failed in Vietnam, or they could not fight in the way that the ground wars in Asia developed in a way that the US military was not fully prepared to handle. And I would say that it happens first in Korea, but that same style of fighting is used in Vietnam against the United States. And again, the US struggles to, militarily address the style of fighting that is happening. So that is my understanding of how and why some of the things unfolded in the way they did. And the US was surprised, like General MacArthur was surprised to have been pushed, all the way to the southern tip of Korea and then having to fight their way back. The US, I think, was unprepared for the force of North Korea, and also, of course, with the backing of China. So I think that there were a lot of elements and factors into that, but that is a great question. Amber asks, what are the views about Korean adoption currently? I think that is such a great question. And one of the things that I have seen and that I think is really exciting is that Korean adoptees have come of age, and they are writing oral histories. They're collecting interviews and conducting oral histories. They're creating documentary films like the one I just shared. They are creating art exhibitions. They are also creating communities for adoptees. And there is, I think, a lot of really important work that's being done for adoptees, in the sense that they're now driving the conversation. Whereas before, as I showed you in some of the footage, that early footage, especially, the narrative was being constructed about them and things were being done to them. And I think now that is really changing with Korean adoptees who are creating their own communities, creating their own ideas of kinship that may fall outside of the ideas of, of family formations as being kin. There are other structures of kinship that I think adoptees are exploring in terms of how they can connect with one another. So I think that has changed dramatically, I would say, in the last 20 years. And in terms of Korean adoption currently in Korea, I should say this too, there are now well over 100,000 Korean adoptees living in the United States. There are probably over 50,000 Korean adoptees living in various European countries like Denmark and Sweden. So this process continued well after the Korean War. And there were a lot of reasons for this. Korea after the war is recovering. There's the next two presidencies, they're actually pushing for mass industrialization in Korea. And then the shift goes from removing mixed race children to sending children who have single mothers out of the country. And this is for again, it goes back to these traditional ideas of the nuclear family and of the patrilineal line in Korea, and the lack of resources for single mothers. And so as you get into the 1970s, there is a push to remove, then the children who are being sent abroad are actually full Korean children. And then in 1988, there is the Korean Olympics. And there's all of this public criticism from the United States, but also from North Korea, blaming South Korea for exporting its children. And at that point, I think you see a real shift in the Korean government, and they try to stop transnational adoptions. They try to promote domestic adoptions, which again, because of the importance of bloodlines in Korea, is quite difficult to take off. So it doesn't really take off in Korea. And the practice is still continuing. I think in 2004, Korea was still like the fourth largest sending country when it comes to Korean transnational adoptions. But I know on the Korean government side, they're trying to end transnational adoptions. I think the last time I heard was the year 2025 was going to be the year that they wanted to stop transnational adoptions completely, but it's unclear how that is going to happen. And I think that once those structures were in place during the Korean War, it really kind of opened the pathway legally and socially for for sending Korean children abroad as a way to help everything from population issues to poverty issues. There are all kinds of ways in which transnational adoption becomes a possible or viable solution. So I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I know that the Korean government has been trying to stop the practice for many years now. Okay, great. Let's see. Amy asks, are you familiar with how Korean-born adoptees regain Korean citizenship if they want to? This is a huge conversation right now in the Korean adoptee community about citizenship, because when you left Korea, well, in the 1950s and 60s, when you left Korea, there was a moment in which the child was completely stateless. They had no legal ties to Korea, and then it took 2 years for them to gain citizenship in the United States. And so there are still some children who did not, and it depends on the adoptive parents. If they go through with that process of gaining citizenship for their adopted children, then everything ends up being fine. But what we're finding today is that there are adoptees for whom the process was never completed. So they find out as adults that they actually don't have US citizenship, and then they're being deported to Korea. So there are several cases where this is happening. In terms of gaining citizenship in Korea, I don't know the details of that. I think they would have to follow the current citizenship rules that exist for anyone to come into Korea. But with adoption, their legal ties, even if they were born in Korea, their legal ties to Korea, from my understanding, are severed, because the understanding is that they would gain citizenship in the United States. But again, there are those cases where that didn't happen, and then people are being left stateless in many cases. But this is definitely something that the adoptee community is focusing on right now to help those who are, without citizenship.
May I ask you, can I make a comment here?
Yes.
Okay. I am in process of helping a couple of Korean-born adoptees, adults in 30s right now, because I've been working with them so closely because through the Friends of Korea network nationwide in this country to support the Korean-born adoptees, I was a weekend Korean language and culture school program principal for 18 years. And they are now adult. They wanted to regain their citizenship. So I've been working with the Korean government to support this process. However, all the documents they put on the website is all in Korean. That doesn't make any sense. And then one document keeps saying that if they want to regain the Korean citizenship back, they need to link their US citizenship. That doesn't make any sense to me. So I've been writing their emails through the San Francisco Chancellor's office a lot, but I haven't gotten clear, responses yet. They keep saying that it's a legal document, so they cannot change it. However, in order for them to get their, citizenship back, somebody needs to support them to be able to submit all these, there are 5 to 7 documents they have to put them together and submit.
Mm-hmm.
Very difficult at this time.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I know that, and this is the tricky part. I think that for a lot of Korean adoptees, they're kind of in this limbo space where neither government is really doing much to help them. They are in this in-between space And I do, thank you so much for sharing, because I wasn't sure. I knew it was tricky. But yeah, none of that makes sense. A document all in Korean for people who don't read Korean. That doesn't make sense. And I can imagine that is really frustrating. I know that there are a lot of Korean adoptees who participate in these return programs that are sponsored by the Korean government, but it's not for citizenship. It's to come back, and then usually the program, if you're interested in reading this, Alina Kim's book, Adopted Territories, which I will write in the chat, but it is a great book that looks at these Korean adoptees who return to Korea and what they experience in these return programs, where the government is saying, we're so sorry we weren't able to care for you, but now we are so proud of you because you are making Korea look so good on the world stage. And Korean adoptees are they feel conflicted about, becoming, at one point not wanted by Korea, and then now being kind of utilized to promote the amazingness of Koreans in the diaspora. So it's a really great book. I'm going to put this in the chat.
While you are doing that, I want to share one more thing at what happened at my university, Sac State University. The reason that we opened the Korean Studies program and Korean language offering since 2013 is because of one of the Korean born adoptees that I taught, and then I got involved in her life. Her name is Rico, and she was accidentally, I found out 2009 that she was taking Japanese language to be able to connect with a Korean mom in Korea, because the white faculty who didn't know about the, between geographic location, the culture, all the stuff between Korea and Japan, she thought that she advised Nicole to take a Japanese language because we didn't have a Korean studies program back then. So she thought that, she saw the the map and saw that Japan is very close to Korea. So she gave her an option, Nicole, do you want to take it Chinese language or, a Japanese language, because they are close, so we don't have a Korean language program. So you can take one of these so that you can talk with your mother. Then 2009 happened. I accidentally found out. Then ever since that, we started to work on 12, Korean American faculty to start the Korean studies program. Now, it's a very popular program at our university, but, it's the reality about understanding about Korean-born adoptees in this country is really, really poor.
Yeah, I think so, which is another reason why I think introducing the idea of Korean adoptees, you could do this with any grade level, really, because again, the article that I showed you, it shows a child. And so I think it's very helpful for, everyone to learn that this is an immigration population. It was spurred by war, but it has continued, and they, there's a very large percentage. I think that the last time I looked, it was something like close to 11% of Korean immigrants are adoptees. That is a huge percentage. So, it is a very significant part of the Korean immigrant experience and story. And so when you're thinking about teaching Korean immigration or about Koreans in the United States, I definitely think that adoptees and military brides should be part of it. And it does get tricky, because there are, I think that you could decide on how deep you go, right? Do you go into U.S. militarized prostitution? Do you go into all of these things? I'm not sure. But I think that even for the younger kids, I think that, learning that there were these children who came at this time, and this is what was being told to the public, but this was also kind of the reality of what they experienced. I think that is something that you could do, and it would be really important for people to, for any grade level to understand about, further about Korean immigration. It is a much broader group of people than what we often think of, I think. So thank you so much for sharing those comments.